Hello, this is Steve Sokol. I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. Before the global pandemic seized our attention, far-right parties in Europe were capturing headlines with provocative statements regarding government shortcomings and anti-immigrant rhetoric. The spread of COVID-19 has changed the political dynamic. In some countries, the corona crisis has weakened the far-right's popularity, but in others, it has enabled far-right politicians to consolidate power. Joining us today from Berlin to talk about the fate of far-right parties in Europe is freelance journalist Emily Schultheis. Emily, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Emily, before we dive in and talk about the far-right in Germany and Europe as a whole, before we started this call, we were talking a little bit about the atmosphere in Berlin right now. As somebody who lives in Kreuzberg, in the heart of Berlin, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like when you leave your apartment?
Sure. It's strange because we've obviously, I'm nearly 7 weeks now into social distancing at home, and yet when I step out my front door, it looks as if there are just about as many people walking around, shopping, sitting outside as there would be on any other normal spring day. And so it's, despite the fact that we've seen the numbers of cases rise in Germany overall, despite the fact that there are several thousand cases here in Berlin, you could be forgiven for forgetting that for a few minutes when you're out, at least in my neighborhood.
So, Emily, let's talk about what's going on in Germany right now. It appears as though Chancellor Merkel's handling of the corona crisis has given her Christian Democratic Party a bit of a shot in the arm. At the same time, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, seems to be losing ground. This comes just as some of the things that the AfD has been clamoring for are being implemented. Those things include tighter border controls within the European Union to slow the free movement of people, as well as a greater role by the nation state. Emily, can you talk about why the AfD is losing traction at a time when one might have expected its support to grow?
Well, I think the interesting thing about what we're seeing is that the AfD has in the past very much, it's a party that thrives on crisis. And so when we talk about the Eurozone crisis or the refugee crisis, these were things that the party was really able to strongly politically instrumentalize and to be able to use that as a potent critique against the sitting government. It seems like a health crisis is different, in part because it's very much not manufactured. This is something that is taking place all over the world, and you see it in very concrete ways with numbers of infections, with the numbers of people who have died both here and in other countries. And it also kind of, had someone explain it to me this way, which I thought was really apt, is the rhetoric of us versus them, which is very key to any populist political message. In the case of the AfD, it's either usually us versus the bureaucrats in Brussels who don't understand our lives, or us versus the refugees and migrants who want to come to our country and are changing things here. You can't really use the us versus them rhetoric when it comes to a health crisis. This is not about someone's country of origin or skin color. This is, anyone on the street, whether they are a longtime German or someone who's recently arrived, is just as likely to infect you with this virus, and everyone is just as vulnerable to something like this. And so you have a kind of narrative pattern that these parties typically follow, and a health crisis is a difficult one to fit into that.
So I think it's interesting to hear you describe that the AfD is a party that thrives on crisis, and certainly one that pits us against them. I've often described the AfD as an amalgam of anti-sentiments. Indeed, it started as an anti-Euro party and an anti-EU party. But as you say, the leadership has had a knack for making the party platform fit the crisis of the moment, whether it was the Euro crisis or the migration crisis. Do you think, though, that there's any way the AfD could use the pandemic to develop a new rallying cry?
Well, I guess I'll give the caveat that everything is changing so quickly right now that, what we talk about this week could be different next week or in 2 weeks or in a month or 6 months. But I guess on that front, I would say to a certain extent, they're already starting to do this. We've seen, as debates in Germany have started about how and when to best open the country safely, and also how and when to open the country in a way that minimizes damage to the economy. You've started to see the AfD jump in on the, open the country immediately to prevent economic disaster. The government doesn't know what it's doing when it comes to ensuring that you have your jobs and your livelihoods. Restaurants should be open. We should be talking about kids back in schools. So they have very much jumped onto the open ASAP bandwagon, and I think it's a more coherent message than we have heard from them in the last weeks, and it seems like that's sort of where they're coalescing toward. So in the short term, that's, I think, going to be the tack that they take. In the longer term, this is where I think you could see them find a message that I think it remains to be seen how resonant this is, but that would echo sort of the kind of anti-Euro rhetoric when they first were started in 2013. There's going to now be debates about how best to help European economies and European countries that have been especially hard hit. And there are, debates about potential so-called Corona bonds. I think then you could see the AfD, and you're already seeing them hint at this, take the strategy of saying, look, it's not our place as Germany to be paying for other European countries that have handled this poorly. And, we absolutely completely oppose any proposed Corona bonds. And so I don't know how resonant that will be, but I think once we get out of the, immediate threat of being infected, once we're past the sort of current stage of things and the attention turns more toward, how do we get ourselves out of this economic hole, that will probably be where we see them take this rhetorically.
So particularly thinking about the economy and how this pandemic has really revealed just how interconnected the global economy is. Do you think that there's any potential that the AfD could become sort of more of an anti-globalization party? Is that perhaps one of the platforms that it would start to take?
I mean, I think they already, to a certain extent, they are already on that platform. And in the immediate aftermath of Germany deciding to close its borders about a month and a half ago, several AfD politicians said this is this is proof of the failure of open borders, globalization, EUization, and so they really kind of see these all as interconnected already, all of these issues. And so, for them talking about an open society and open borders also has very much to do with openness to the world more broadly. So yeah, I think we will certainly see them ramp up discussion of those things going forward.
I guess, we've touched on a couple of different topics here, and I'd like to maybe parse two of them. The first one is, coming back to what you said at the beginning about us versus them. Right-wing populist parties have often scapegoated and targeted minorities. This has often happened in economically difficult times. And one of our viewers today wants to know, how is it going for refugees and immigrants to Germany right now?
To be honest, I don't know more about their specific situation than I do about Germans or those living in Germany more broadly. I mean, it is typically true that refugees and recent arrivals, might not have the same kind of stable job that others have, and so would be at more of a risk for being financially harmed by this situation. The government has taken pretty significant actions to increase money for what they call Kurzarbeit, so short-term work, or the idea that you would be paid for at least part of your work even if you're not working in the short term. So there are things in place. I will say that I do not specifically know how that applies to the refugee community.
And I guess sort of sticking with this for just a second, I mean, one of the things that we haven't really seen yet has been an increase in racist or anti-Semitic or anti-immigrant rhetoric from the AfD at this time. How do you think that might play out in the months to come?
Well, I've seen a few of their, they're most active on Facebook. That's where they interact with most of their supporters. And I've seen a couple of posts saying things like, migrants also need to follow social distancing rules, as if they weren't doing that, I guess, before, as if they weren't being held to the same standards. So there are still hints of that and instances of that. But I think you're right that that has not been the focus. They very much shifted to being critical of the government, calling for things to reopen, and being very critical of any financial help for other EU countries.
Thanks. The other thing, though, that I wanted to come back to is a little bit about sort of the economic piece, the economic recovery. You had talked at the outset about how Germany's coming out of the lockdown right now. There is some uncertainty about what happens next. Before this call started, we were talking about the next 2 weeks being very telling for Germany and for the German economy. I guess one question that I have as it relates to the AfD is, if the recovery in Germany does not go well, both in terms of public health, but also in terms of the economics of it, do you think that the AfD will sort of run to the barricades claiming government mismanagement and use that as a way of mobilizing people?
I don't doubt that they would use that as an argument in that situation. What I'm not sure about, and this is something I've thought about, I've lived here for 3 years now. I've thought about this sort of throughout, because the idea that there will at some point in the not so distant future be an economic recession has been kind of hanging over things for a while. And so obviously now there's no doubt that we are entering a probably extremely deep recession across the world. I guess I'm of two minds on this. I think on the one hand, you could see them, just as, for example, they have very successfully appealed to people in Eastern Germany in particular, who are considerably at a considerable economic disadvantage compared to their counterparts in the West. You could see them applying some of the same kinds of rhetoric and appealing to the same kinds of frustrations when it comes to a massive global recession. On the other hand, I think you see during this health crisis that people in Germany are overwhelmingly looking to government officials, looking to experts, looking to established media for their information, and looking less to parties like the AfD or the kinds of news sources that their supporters usually turn to. So I guess I think at the moment it seems like there's very much a yearning for stable expert leadership, and I wonder if we were in the midst of a deep economic crisis here, if that would be similar. If you would also see people wanting the adults in the room, people wanting the experienced, for example, steady hand of Chancellor Merkel to get through something like that. So I don't know. I guess I think that's a really big open question.
Yeah, undoubtedly, we'll see how a lot of these things play out in the weeks and months to come. One of our viewers has posed a question using chat, and so I'd like to remind everybody else that if you have a question for Emily Schultheis, you can ask that question via chat. But the question is, news media outlets recently published pictures of refugee camps in Greece. The camps look terrible. Has the condition of the camps elicited a reaction of any kind in Germany? The pictures came when a few very young refugees were brought to Germany and Luxembourg in the last couple of weeks.
Yes, there's been a reaction in Germany, but I think, unfortunately, also my apologies, this is my iMessage and I do not know how to make it stop making noise. Hopefully my friend will stop texting me now. So I think, yes, there has been a reaction, and there has been, there has been on the part of many politicians, outrage at the conditions there and interest in taking in particularly the children. It seems in recent weeks as if though that, like everything else, has been overshadowed by the response to the coronavirus crisis. And, I know that we have indeed, or Germany has indeed taken in some of the children, but there were originally far higher projections or proposals for how many people should be taken in. And it seems as if that's either been revised downward or perhaps postponed.
So we've talked a lot about the AfD and what's going on the far right in German politics. Let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about the party landscape as a whole. Angela Merkel and the Christian Democrats are enjoying very high approval ratings at the moment. Do you think that moving forward, the CDU might be under less pressure to move to the right than it was just a few months ago before the crisis hit?
Yes. Again, I think that with the caveat that the leadership election is now scheduled for December, and it is very difficult to know what the world will look like in December. At the moment, at least, I think that people are, compared with early to mid-February, where there was various domestic developments that made people feel it was urgent to find a new replacement for Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and someone to succeed Merkel. I think that people are very happy these days that Merkel is still at the helm. People have been reminded of the benefits of having someone who is stable, who is a bit more cautious. And yeah, so I think that it's, if you look at the sort of shadow race for CDU leader that is still underway, of course not officially at the moment, but the people who had expressed interest in the position, many of them have some role to play in the handling of this crisis. It's the person who had most represented this sort of sharp break to the right, Friedrich Merz, has kind of been under the radar throughout this whole situation. I think his biggest claim to fame has been that he himself contracted COVID-19. But so, it doesn't mean that debate couldn't again shift back. I think we're in a very strange and very rapid break from the status quo right now. And we don't know if in a few months things will start to return to normal, or at least however, political normal was before this crisis started. But yeah, I think overall it removes some of the pressure for the party to take a new course, because people seem to be quite content with the leadership of the government, and primarily then by the Christian Democrats.
Emily, you touched a little bit on this, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts on how you think the pandemic has influenced the race to succeed Angela Merkel. Of course, someone like Jens Spahn, the health minister, has gotten a lot of visibility. Markus Söder, the minister-president of Bavaria, has been seen as a very strong leader at this time. Do you think that they might gain traction in an already filled field with people like Friedrich Merz, who you mentioned, but also Armin Laschet and Norbert Röttgen?
Yes, I think that it becomes, all of these people are effectively in the midst of real life auditions for how they would handle crisis situations in the future, should they be elected party leader and then eventually chancellor, or not in Söder's case for party leader, but chancellor. And so I think that for those who are in really high profile positions at the moment, so Spahn, for Söder, for Laschet, this could either be a really excellent way to show how effective their leadership skills are, particularly for Söder and Laschet, who are in executive roles in their respective states, both of which have been pretty hard hit by the virus. The downside comes if their strategies don't work well, if things go poorly in their state, and then you end up in a situation where what could have been a political opportunity and an opportunity to show good management skills end up becoming the opposite. And then I think for Spahn, Spahn has just had there's been quite a bit of attention paid to the fact that he's, on CNBC, he's on CNN, speaking in fluent English to American and international news outlets to sort of explain what Germany's doing and how other places could follow some of the best practices. And that's, he's someone who has obviously had a fairly high profile position within the government now for a while, but it's nothing compared to the kind of high profile position he's in now.
I'd like to maybe widen the aperture and talk a little bit about Europe and what's going on in Europe as a whole. And we actually have a question from one of our viewers that provides a nice segue to that. The question is, Chancellor Merkel has indicated her support for a significant temporary increase in the EU budget to finance an EU recovery fund. What is the likely support for this EU initiative in the government, the CDU, and more broadly in the German parliament?
I think the debates about that, I think that there is interest in and willingness in offering financial support of some kind. I think the biggest debate is going to be about the level of that support and how and when it's distributed. And so, you have, as you noted, and as the audience member noted, Merkel has very much expressed support for this. You see varying levels of agreement with her within the CDU. I think it'll also depend a little bit. I mean, we've seen some polling on this in terms of the views of the broader German population, and there is overwhelming support for financial help of some kind. I think the problem again comes down to this question of how much is it, how fast is it, and how all does this get sorted out.
So in addition to covering the AfD in Germany, you've written extensively about the far right elsewhere in Europe, particularly in the East. And populist leaders in places like Hungary and Poland have used the pandemic to consolidate power. They've said that many of the measures that they've taken will actually be temporary measures. But how concerned are you as an observer of what's going on there? How concerned are you that these will be permanent measures that are introduced in those countries?
Moderately, decently concerned. I think the fact that in Hungary that so there was emergency legislation passed that gives Prime Minister Viktor Orban essentially the ability to do what he wants. And the very fact that there was not a concrete end date put on that, or even some sort of benchmarks for when one can determine the end of something like this is worrying. And it's, the government has sort of pushed back in Hungary saying that descriptions of this as the latest authoritarian turn are far overblown, that the international media is taking it out of context and doesn't understand what the measures have really been meant for. But you've seen Orban take some worrying steps in the meantime, trying to reduce funding for opposition parties, trying to take powers away from cities and municipalities, many of which were won back by opposition parties last fall. And so I think it depends, obviously in this case, every country is taking extraordinary measures right now, and measures that you would not normally consider to be part of a regular liberal democracy. The question becomes what you do with those powers, and I think from what we can see in Hungary, there are already worrying signs about the extent to which Orban plans to use that for non-virus related items. And then, turning to Poland, today is the 30th of April, so on May 10th, Poland is supposed to hold a presidential election that's been long scheduled. The very fact that it is unclear at this point, still unclear if that is in fact going to happen, is pretty worrying for talks about free, fair, and well-run elections. The ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, has proposed doing all of this an entirely vote-by-mail election, which in theory sounds great. The problem is just that Poland has never done anything on a scale like that before. And so you've had prominent politicians in the opposition say that so the main opposition party has said that they will boycott the election. Several of them have said, out of a sense of decency, that people should also protest the vote. And so it's hard to imagine how any election that is being thrown together so last minute in such a way that is unprecedented, with opposition effectively unable to campaign and uninterested in participating, how anything that comes out of that could be a free and fair result.
You know, there are two words that I sort of keep coming back to at the moment in almost every conversation. The one is unprecedented, you know, this being an unprecedented time for all of us that we're living in. But the other is uncertainty, right? And that this is such an uncertain time. We just don't know what will happen next. And so, you know, although you might not have a crystal ball to look into and think about these things, I wonder if some of these authoritarian leaders are helped or hindered by whether or not the coronavirus gets worse or better. In cases like Hungary and Poland, is it possible that these leaders would lose support, would lose traction if the crisis gets worse, despite the measures that they've imposed? Or have they been enabled because of this crisis to grab hold of power in such a way that they're not going to give it up anytime soon? As you think about the future in some of these countries, and I mean, this is purely speculation, of course, but how do you think some of these things will play out? Do you have any scenarios in your mind for what could happen next?
I will say that I sort of stopped giving up concrete predictions after the 2016 election in the US, so take it with a grain of salt. I do think, I mean, look, I think that especially in the case of Hungary, Orban has been in power for 10 years now. He has very methodically and slowly taken over or dissolved or sort of undermined various aspects of democratic institutions. He started with the media. He went to parliament and the electoral system. He has now, in the last year, taken on sort of traditional family policies, LGBT, independent research. This is someone who very much has thought through how to have control over effectively everything and saw an opportunity here. And I think in his case, it will be hard to, I think it'll be hard to reverse what we're seeing in Hungary, or at least fully reverse what we're seeing in Hungary right now. I think for both countries, though, I do think there's some merit in the idea that if things were to get really bad there, that these leaders would or could potentially see a loss in support. And in the case of Poland, that's why you are seeing the ruling Law and Justice Party so eager to hold the election now versus in the fall, as has potentially been proposed, or even further out in the future. I think they're very concerned. They think that the incumbent President Duda is as likely to win now and potentially even win outright in a first round, getting the majority. He's about in as good a position as he could be in, and they're concerned that whether it be the health impact on people if the virus really does pick up there, or the economic impact, that the party would struggle in the polls in the fall. I think in Hungary, it's, you know, the next election is still a ways away. However, Hungary has seen under Viktor Orban pretty significant reductions in funding for hospitals, in the kinds of supplies, the kinds of facilities that you would need, and has seen a lot of money directed toward things like building a very, very massive soccer stadium in Viktor Orban's hometown. And so I think then you could theoretically, in that case, if people recognize how poorly equipped the health system is, and that there were things that very easily could have been done to prevent that, perhaps that also leads to more frustration with him. But that all depends on how the next couple of months ultimately unfold.
Again, a lot of uncertainty. You know, we don't know what the world is going to look like a month from now, let alone 6 months from now. There's so much that's changing. Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question for Emily Schultheis, you can use the chat function, or send me an email at sokol@acgusa.org. Emily, I'd like to sort of ask you a question about the nexus, or a question that falls somewhere at the nexus between populist movements, the corona crisis, and your craft, journalism. Yesterday, the Princeton professor, Jan Werner Müller, published a piece on rising authoritarianism and a decline in local news coverage at a time when we need more, not less, accurate reporting. And this is what he wrote, quote, "One of the main tragedies of the COVID-19 pandemic is that it comes at a time when local media have been decimated in many countries, and when authoritarians such as US President Donald Trump, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have been waging all-out war on independent journalism," end quote. So Emily, I guess the question to you is, as a freelance journalist, are you concerned about the future of journalism at this time?
Sure, definitely. Based on anecdotal evidence of things I've heard from friends who are reporters either back in the States or across Europe, yeah, I'm concerned. I think that financially, news organizations have struggled, as you say, particularly on the local level, to stay afloat for a long time now. And news organizations, just like any business, any part of our economies right now, are going to be facing the same kind of economic hits that the small business around the corner, or that restaurants, stores, basically everyone is facing. And so I have friends who've been furloughed. I have friends whose pay has been cut until further notice. Know people who've been laid off. When we talk about Hungary, there's also another concerning aspect of what Prime Minister Orban has done in response to the coronavirus situation, which is to pass legislation essentially saying anyone who is proven to have published either false information or information that impedes the government's ability to appropriately fight the coronavirus crisis could be sentenced to 5 years in prison. And friends and colleagues who are among the remaining independent journalists in Hungary worry about how that law could be used against them. And so, Viktor Orban has done a pretty good job of chipping away at independent media in Hungary, and they worry that this could be one of the final nails in the coffin of their ability to do their job freely.
This is a bit of a non sequitur, but one of our viewers has a question that goes in a different direction, and it is, have there been any political reactions to the shutdown of Hezbollah in Germany, or is it too early to see any reaction?
To be honest, that's a bit outside of my wheelhouse. I've seen the initial news, but I haven't seen a whole lot in terms of reactions yet.
Then maybe let's begin to wrap up. Give people one last chance to pose a question, but let me perhaps ask you about the political landscape as a whole. Obviously, we talked about the AfD at the beginning of our call. We talked about the CDU and the wrangling within the CDU and whether or not the party would move further to the right. But we haven't even talked about the left side of the political spectrum and about the opposition, the other opposition parties. The Green Party, of course, has lost some of the support that it had at the beginning of the year. The Social Democrats seem to be holding steady at not so wonderful rate. I wonder, what are your thoughts about some of the other parties and how they're able to weather the storm of COVID-19?
I think that is, again, we will have to see how all of this goes, but in the short term, you really have seen that parties not in government are struggling generally, whether that is the far right, whether that is the Greens, whether that is the left. As you said, the Social Democrats have sort of held steady, I suspect because they are part of this governing coalition, and at least one of their politicians, Olaf Scholz, has been pretty visible throughout this crisis as well. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a struggle for anyone besides the governing party to get any attention at the moment, whether it is on coronavirus pandemic related questions, or whether it is, for example, for the Greens on climate issues, which is of course a piece of this debate, because as you've had almost no planes flying in the air and emissions down worldwide lately, that is certainly still a part of the discussion, and it's not as if climate change goes away because there's a pandemic. But I do think, for the Greens, they had been on such a remarkable rise over the last 18 months, nearly 2 years, and the focus on climate change had taken on such a stronger and really dominant role in political discussions. And unfortunately, at the moment, the coronavirus is pretty much eclipsing every issue in people's minds. So for opposition parties, I mean, I think that they are going to sort of have to bide their time a little bit and see how things go. There might be more of an opening again once we return to even a remote inkling of the status quo, and people can have debates about things that are not just the immediate response to the virus. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you look, for example, next door in Austria, a lot of countries have this rally around the flag, rally around the governing coalition effect at the moment. And in Austria, where the Greens are in power, they're actually reaching their highest result in the polls in I don't know how many years. It's possibly even unprecedented. So it very much depends not on the individual actions of the opposition parties right now, but I think also is in large part because people are very much sticking with the governing coalition and giving them their trust for now.
Thank you, Emily. One of the questions that just came in via chat is, do you know if there are any active relationships between the AfD and right-wing populist parties or groups elsewhere, particularly in places like the UK and the United States?
Absolutely. These parties are, well, it's a little bit sort of oxymoronic to talk about an international gathering of nationalist parties. And you see this on the European level, that sometimes it's difficult for far-right parties to ultimately collaborate on an international level when it comes to policy. Everybody has different national interests, and oftentimes those national interests clash with each other. You do see them very much in conversation with each other, whether it is actual ties between party members. For example, thinking again about Austria, the ties between the Freedom Party, the FPÖ there, and the AfD are very strong. You see ties with parties like the League and Matteo Salvini in Italy. You see parties or ties between German far-right politicians and those in the Netherlands. So, it's very much, there is an informal collaboration, and there is also very much, they pay attention, and this is where I think the US comes in as well. Everybody's sort of watching what each other is doing and listening to the way that each other, that everyone is talking about these issues and sort of trying to learn from each other. And so while I don't like to overstate the influence of former Trump advisor Steve Bannon in Europe, because I think sometimes that gets perhaps a little bit overblown, I do think that the kind of economic populism message that he very much is in favor of is something that you really do hear far-right leaders in Europe listening to and learning from, and kind of in rhetorical conversation with.
Well, Emily Schultheis, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today and for talking with us on this range of topics. We look forward to following your reporting, even though I'm sure it's challenging to be reporting while you're sheltering in place.
A lot of phone calls.
Lots of phone calls, I believe it. But thank you very much for being with us. And thanks to all of our viewers today. Best wishes to everyone, and stay healthy.
Thanks so much for a great chat.
Thank you. Bye, Emily.